So when a genre-defining game comes out and blows up on the scene, creating its own sizable fan base and style of game, it's only natural in this cutthroat industry of game development and sales figures that other titles will materialize in order to compete with their own take on that specific genre or style. For example, Mario had Sonic, Street Fighter had Mortal Kombat, Quake had Unreal Tournament, and World of Warcraft had basically every other MMO during the late 2000s. It's almost expected at this point, when a series becomes exceedingly popular, rival franchises are going to rise up to tap into the new market that's been created, which inevitably leads to a lot of fan bickering about which franchise is better. And even a niche series like Devil May Cry is no different. Otogi Myth of Demons was effectively Xbox and From Software's response to Sony's DMC, with a character using sweet sword combos to rid the land of demons. Tecmo and Team Ninja revived the Ninja Gaiden franchise in 2004 and shifted the 2D platformer to a 3D hack-and-slash beat-em-up game with a similar focus on challenging difficulty and a deep combat system that was reminiscent of Devil May Cry, though much more difficult. And when 2K Games had to make a tie-in for the new Ghost Rider movie in 2007, they seemed to take a lot of notes from the character action genre, including a style meter that had a very Devil May Cry ranking system to it, where it would go up as you damage demons without taking damage yourself. And then you would be graded at the end of a level depending on how well you did. Also, honestly, this game is way better than any movie tie-in game has any right to be. Even Capcom devs were attempting to recapture the magic of the DMC series with games like Chaos Legion and a Nightmare Before Christmas character action game. And no, I'm not making that up. But the game that is seen by most as Devil May Cry's closest competition in the character action market is actually Platinum Games' Bayonetta, which is interesting because it was actually made by many of the same people that originally created the Devil May Cry series and effectively started the whole character action genre in the first place. Considering this, while Bayonetta definitely owes a lot to DMC, it actually shows the evolution that the genre and its creators went through since its humble origins at Capcom Studio 4 in 2001, and arguably can be credited for keeping character action games alive in the mainstream when DMC wasn't around. But enough talking about it, let's just get into it. Without further ado, this is my Bayonetta retrospective.
Let's rock, baby!
So before we can really delve into Bayonetta proper, we have to look at where it came from and who created it, as that would inform a lot of what Bayonetta would be. And to do that properly, we actually have to go all the way back to when DMC 1 first came out. As I've said in a previous video, for whatever reason, when Capcom decided they wanted to develop a sequel to Devil May Cry, they didn't bring any of the previous development staff onto the project. In fact, Hideki Kamiya and the rest of Team Little Devils didn't even know that a DMC 2 project was underway until after it had already started. Something that disappointed Kamiya since DMC was his passion project and he wanted to continue working on it. Devil May Cry 1 was the first time Kamiya was able to put all his love of classic arcade games into his own cool, stylish creation, and having it taken away from him was understandably frustrating. Even after the unidentified director for the sequel was let go due to the game's development being, well, kind of a nightmare, Capcom called upon Hideaki Itsuno to come clean up the mess rather than bring back on Kamiya. Though it's hard to say if this was because someone higher up in Capcom just didn't like Kamiya, or he was just busy at the time. Because while the dumpster fire that was DMC 2's development was going on, Team Little Devils had moved on to effectively become Team Beautiful, as a lot of the production staff that worked on the first Devil May Cry went on to develop Kamiya's new game,
Beautiful Joe.
Developed for the GameCube as part of the Capcom 5, which is frankly a story for another day. Beautiful Joe told the story of Joe, a young, brash protagonist in red who has to travel into a movie world to fight a group of eccentric monsters in order to save his girlfriend. But at the climax of the story, finds out that the true villain is actually the father of his love interest, before having a climactic battle in space to protect the world, with the game ending with the couple continuing on to another adventure. Some of this sounds weirdly familiar. Unlike other Kamiya games at the time though, the gameplay of Beautiful Joe was designed as a 2D platform brawler, with Joe having powers similar to that of filming techniques, including having the ability to temporarily slow down time, which is a gameplay mechanic we would see in a later Kamiya game. Overall, Beautiful Joe was a solid new IP for the GameCube, and had inventive ways of adding life to the 2D action platformer genre, which was starting to disappear more and more with the emergence of the 3D platformers of the time. But while Kamiya and his team clearly put a lot of love and effort into making Beautiful Joe, as it has all the over-the-top charm and somewhat patronizing player performance grading that he is known for, it was clear he was still a bit sour about not being able to continue working on DMC, as he put many references to it in the Beautiful Joe games, even going so far as having Dante and Trish as playable characters in other versions of the game. Regardless, Beautiful Joe received critical success when it initially released, regularly scoring high on many gaming sites. Though, despite the acclaim it was receiving, its sales did poorer than Capcom had expected. However, since the budget of the game was relatively low, it was considered a commercial success for how much it earned, meaning that a sequel was greenlit. But this time, Capcom actually let Kamiya and his team Beautiful stay on for the second game's development. In fact, in order to expedite the development of Beautiful Joe 2, as well as the PS2 port of the first game, a lot of the staff in Capcom Studio 4, namely Atsushi Inaba, who produced the first Devil May Cry and Ace Attorney games, Shinji Mikami, the Resident Evil guy, and our boy Hideki Kamiya, were turned into Clover Studios. Aside from making the Beautiful Joe games though, Clover Studios was meant to be a semi-autonomous second-party developer working under Capcom's umbrella in order to create new IPs for the publisher, while the main Capcom studios continued working on their beloved legacy franchises, like Mega Man and Dino Crisis. So between 2004 and 2006, while DMC3 was being made by Itsuno and his team in Capcom Studio 1, the staff over at Clover were working on their own big titles. First, there was Beautiful Joe 2, a solid continuation of the Beautiful series that followed where the first game left off. Then there was Okami, another title helmed by Kamiya that used a classic Japanese ink painting style of cel shading to tell the story of the god Amaterasu, in a world heavily inspired by Shinto mythology, with gameplay inspired by the Legend of Zelda series. And the final notable title released by the studio was the Mikami-directed God Hand, which could be seen as a more overtly comedic, melee-focused version of Devil May Cry, with over 100 different martial arts moves that could be performed by the protagonist Jean, as he fought evil punk rockers, the Power Rangers, and Satan. When looked back on, Clover Studios definitely lived up to their promise of creating clever and unique IPs for their parent company that fans loved. Though, while Beautiful Joe 2, Okami, and God Hand were more or less critical hits across the board, and were seen as quite innovative for their time, they weren't what Capcom would call financial successes, with Okami and Beautiful Joe initially only selling approximately 300,000 units each, and God Hand reportedly selling even less than that. And it was due to Clover's titles not meeting their sales expectations that Capcom started to oppose the more risky ideas the developers had, resulting in many of the staff in the studio feeling creatively stifled. It was this clash between developers and publisher that inevitably resulted in Kamiya, Mikami, and Inaba leaving with many of the studio's talents, namely the ones who made up Team Beautiful, in order to create their own studio, which would inevitably lead to the formation of Platinum Games in early 2007, as well as the creation of Bayonetta. Now that the devs from Clover had made their own studio to work out of, they were no longer limited by Capcom's restrictions and could make more of the games they wanted to. However, forming a successful studio isn't as easy as it may sound, so the first year of Platinum Games had the developers now limited by a lack of resources. And so, while producers like Inaba were getting publishers together to help with funding new projects, Kamiya and the other devs in the studio spent a lot of time writing game proposals. Initially, Kamiya started with ideas he thought were more safe and publisher-friendly, which is rather ironic considering the end result of this, but after talking with some of the other staff at the studio, namely Yusuke Hashimoto, Kamiya realized that this was an opportunity to make another one of his hardcore character action games like Devil May Cry. He never got to continue with that type of game after DMC1, and a lot of the staff at Platinum had worked on Kamiya's previous action games, so it made perfect sense to play to the strengths of the talent there. And so he and a team of devs started working on this new title. But now the question was what the focus of the game was going to be. Kamiya and the development team knew they wanted to make another classic 3D action game, but didn't really have any ideas past that. Well, much like these things tend to, it was one idea that set the whole thing in motion. And in this case, that was, hey, what if we made the main character a woman? The character action genre, as well as a majority of games, are predominantly full of male protagonists, so Kamiya and his team at Platinum thought it would be interesting to make the main character of their new character action game a woman. And everything about the game effectively built off that single idea. The way the main character would move during combat and cutscenes, the personality of the character, as well as how she acted towards others in the story, the music that was used, the fact that her hair was integral to her overall design, the ability that the character could use her hair to summon demonic powers in order to destroy her enemies in torturous ways. These ideas were all drawn from the concept that the character was female. Even the name Bayonetta is a feminine twist on the World War II weapon, the bayonet, which is a blade placed at the end of a rifle, which was a fitting analogy for Bayonetta's mix-up of close-up combat while using long-range weapons, which we'll be getting to later. A lot of the people that would make up the dev team, eventually titled Team Little Angels, loved the idea of creating effectively a feminine version of Dante, as it allowed for a lot of interesting possibilities that they had never had the chance to do. But Bayonetta's female aspects also led to a lot of issues in the development stage, or more specifically, her design did. Early on in the game's development, Kamiya gave the job of designing Bayonetta's overall look to Mari Shimazaki, and told her a few things he wanted to be incorporated in the design. That she was a modern style of witch, that her design should be black, as that's what you think of when you think witch, and that she should have hair that could flow when she moved in the game. With this information, Shimazaki came up with some really great initial designs, and actually came pretty close to what the final look would be a couple of times. But when the development team started incorporating these looks into the initial builds of the game, they found it just wasn't working, with the biggest problem being Bayonetta's flowing hair blocking her body, which made it tough to see attacks, and this wasn't going to work in a style of game where you need to be able to see every motion the enemy does. Something with the design just wasn't clicking with Bayonetta's aesthetics, which meant a lot of retries with different looks and styles, and figuring out how Bayonetta would look in the game ended up taking a lot of development time. If you look at the Bayonetta art book, there are 10 pages of just raw concept art for Bayonetta's design that never made it in, which is a lot when you compare it to how quickly they seem to reach the final designs for all the other characters in the game. And supposedly Dante's look came together pretty effortlessly too in retrospect. When you look at some of the designs they did later when trying to figure out what worked, it was as if the more the team spent trying to figure out what was wrong, the further away they got from what worked about the original designs. Eventually though, after a lot of debating amongst the staff about what was and wasn't working, there were two things that would lead to Bayo's now iconic design. Firstly, there was integrating her hair into her outfit. Rather than having her hair flowing around Bayonetta, it was changed so that the hair was a conduit for her witch powers, and magically wove it into the skin-tight ensemble she wore, which resulted in probably one of the most embarrassing scenes for a parent to walk in on when this idea is established in the game. This choice of attire led to the development team going back to one of the original pieces of concept art for Bayo, adding a few slight tweaks to add some visual flair, like a beehive hairdo in order to simulate a classic witch's hat, and making a design that everyone on the team liked, both in concept art and in-game. Interestingly, the hair-down version of Bayonetta would still be used in the game, but only as a powered-up form when Bayonetta went serious against bosses and needed to tap into her powers. Because magic. The other element to Bayonetta's design that cemented her look was her glasses. While it might seem like an innocuous detail to her overall aesthetic, it was central to her character, at least from Kamiya's point of view. He thought that considering her strength as a character, both in terms of personality and fighting prowess, glasses would give her some air of authority, like a teacher or librarian, though this all could have just been to feed into a particular fetish Kamiya has. Aside from adding to the dominating presence of the character, this glasses decision had the added benefit of making Bayonetta stand out as a video game protagonist, as this feature separated her from the other video game heroines. When you search female video game characters, there's a distinct lack of eyewear across the board, so Bayonetta's intrinsically designed glasses gave her a unique look, among other things. However, while all of Team Little Angels liked the look of her glasses, there were others that didn't, namely the higher-ups at Platinum. For whatever reason, they didn't like Bayonetta with the eyewear and wanted them removed, possibly because they thought a character wearing glasses would be tougher to market. Kamiya refused though, heavily believing that her glasses were vital to her design and made her more unique. This back and forth went on for a while, but eventually the higher-ups gave up to Kamiya's stubbornness, knowing he wasn't going to back down on this decision, and they were right to do so. In fact, Kamiya was so stubborn that even after the higher-ups relented, he proceeded to not only keep Bayonetta's glasses, but also to put glasses on every single character in the game. Now, aside from this being a funny behind-the-scenes story, the main reason I included this little bit of trivia here was to show how persistent Kamiya was about his vision of the game. He did take recommendations from his team, but this was Kamiya's baby. This was his chance to do the Devil May Cry sequel he never got to do, and without all the creative restrictions he had when he was at Capcom. It was a chance to show all the things he'd learned and implement all the ideas he thought of since 2001. When you look at it in retrospect, in a lot of ways, Bayonetta is actually the natural conclusion to Kamiya's years as a game developer and director, as it took a lot of what he had done in his previous works at Capcom and developed those ideas to the next level. This isn't to discount the many people that were involved with the development of the game, but much like how you can tell a David Cage game from a Swery game from a Yoko Taro game, due to the way they are structured and presented, you can tell that Bayonetta is a Kamiya game to its very core. From the eccentric characters, the extravagant action, the chapter-based flow to the game, the combat that focuses on being as stylish as possible, and the many gameplay sections that are send-ups to the old-school arcade games that Kamiya spent hours playing as a kid. Though, while Bayonetta shows a lot of similar designs and story elements to Kamiya's previous games like Devil May Cry and Beautiful Joe, there were improvements that showed Kamiya and his team had evolved their understanding of the character action genre and game development as a whole, years after finishing their time on DMC1, and incorporated a lot of what they'd learned working on other titles since then, which you can really see in how they defined Bayonetta as a character. For example, where Dante had this pizza-loving rocker persona he portrayed, having a very Devil May Care attitude unless otherwise pushed to the limit, in which the tone suddenly shifts to full melodrama.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
Bayonetta's more posh and proper, while still having the cheeky attitude that Kamiya's protagonists tend to have, just with a more English tone to it.
A single tear and you'll be crying alone. Got it?
Okay, Mummy.
Ugh.
Even when fighting against godlike beings, she talks to them as if they're a store clerk she's displeased with for not selling her favorite brand of wine.
I'm sorry. I forgot to mention one of the reasons I hunt your kind. You're much too ugly not to put out of your misery.
Interestingly, when considering the character of Bayonetta, Kamiya even thought of her as being English, which wasn't something a lot of Japanese developers thought of when making a character in Japan. Typically, the English voice for characters are something the localization team deals with after the fact. But Kamiya was insistent that she have an English voice actress rather than a Japanese one, since he thought an English voice suited Bayo's personality better. So Helena Taylor was cast to provide the main voice of the character, and effectively defined the personality of Bayonetta, giving her a posh manner of speaking while still maintaining a hint of snark to her tone.
You need to hone your sense of smell, my dear. There's no rosemary in the perfume. After all, rosemary's a demon repellent.
In comparison to DMC, Bayonetta also has the benefit of having a larger cast of side characters for the main character to interact with throughout the story. From her demonic weapons dealer / bartender who she shares a mutual love of beating angels with, to her Italian stereotype informant who she has very little respect for, to her rival / best friend who she fights with throughout the game, to the supposed womanizing man who's trying to catch Bayonetta for killing his father, whom she regularly likes to tease and flirt with. It's in these interactions with these other characters that we get to see glimpses of Bayonetta's personality beyond the nonchalant attitude she has when fighting angels. And that's not something we saw a lot out of in the early Devil May Cry games.
You never cease to amuse me, Cheshire. I suppose that's your next target?
Though, probably one of the most notable things when looking at Bayo as a character is her body language, as she's much more expressive in her movements compared to her PS2 predecessors, which brings me to probably one of the more controversial aspects of Bayonetta. Pretty much since Bayonetta's inception, a question that continues to linger around the game is this sexist? Between Bayonetta posing sexily during cutscenes and getting naked in order to summon demons, the game has resulted in a lot of raised eyebrows with both players and critics. Now, it can be easy to say that Bayonetta's design and movement were to make her as sexy as possible in order to appeal to male gamers, which is definitely a fair critique considering Kamiya wanted the character to be sexy, and this aspect was heavily used as marketing for the game. But when you get into it, you can see there's a bit more at play than just that. From the way she taunts her enemies to how she physically interacts with other characters, a lot of Bayonetta's confidence as a character and her personality comes through her expressive body movements, which can be heavily contributed to two people on the development staff, namely Bayonetta's motion capture dancer, simply named Maiko, whose unique style of dance was used for Bayonetta's now iconic way of moving, and Yuji Shinamura, who directed the cinematics of the game and dictated how Bayo would move during cutscenes and how this reflected her personality. Through her movements, you can see how confident Bayonetta is with how she struts into a scene, how unintimidated she is by the messengers of God coming to attack her when she German suplexes a group of them, and how unfamiliar she is with children with how she picks up little Cereza like a small kitten. Which, by the way, is honestly one of the best scenes in the game in terms of characterization.
Well, a crying baby cockroach would be truly terrible. So don't you dare cry.
Yes, Mommy.
Fine.
Also, as opposed to how many female characters are put into sexy costumes or vulnerable situations in order to titillate the player, titillate. With how Bayonetta is played during the cutscenes and in-game, it's hard to see her being taken advantage of in this way, as she is always shown to be the one in control. She uses her powers to fight all her enemies single-handedly, she's the one that imposes her sexuality rather than it being imposed on her, and the one time she's captured in the story, it's another woman that comes to save her. Bayonetta is quite literally a strong, independent woman.
You'll have to learn to wipe that stupid look off your face, or I'll never let you keep chasing me around this world. Got that?
Much like with how Dante being able to shrug off impalements and being able to juggle demons is a bit of a power fantasy, Kamiya and his team wanted to make the player feel cool through how the character acts, as this is who you are in the game's world. And with Bayonetta, a lot of that is conveyed by how much the character is in control of everything around her, including her own sexuality. Does this make Bayo an extremely nuanced character or some type of feminist icon? Not really, but it does make her more than a sexy lamp or just a piece of fan service to be fawned over. Sexiness is a defining feature of Bayonetta for sure, but it isn't her only trait. And she also loves being sexy, which is why it's kind of entertaining to see her using an enemy's staff like a stripper pole as a way to fight them. She's enjoying herself, and by extension you enjoy it. It's cathartic in a very cheesecake kind of way. So while it's worth considering how the game frames her as a sex object and whether it may or may not be sexist, it's equally worth noting that Bayonetta is more than that within the context of the game itself. And now that we've addressed that elephant in the room, we can finally look at one of the strongest aspects of Bayonetta as a game, the combat. When it comes to the gameplay of a character action game, the combat is all about having a certain catharsis to it, where it needs to be easily picked up by new players so that they're able to beat down enemies and do cool combos early on, building the confidence to learn more about the combat and continue playing, while having some complexity that leaves room for it to be expanded on the more you experiment and learn how the mechanics work together. And this is exactly the type of gameplay that Bayonetta perfectly encapsulates, having this really enjoyable impact to it that makes it fun to play around with, but has an almost infinite amount of depth to it once you get into it. To start, early on in the development, it was decided that Bayonetta would not only use guns with her hands to fight, but also have ones that were attached to her feet, having a look similar to a heel. This idea then evolved so that, instead of having individual weapons that needed to be swapped between use, Bayonetta could equip two separate weapons to her arms and legs individually, with one button dedicated to each, which would allow for more customization and choices for the player to experiment with. The Devil May Cry games only ever had one button that was used for melee attacks, so the variety in combos was quite limited until you knew all the intricacies to the mechanics. But Bayonetta immediately gives a lot more options by having both a punch and kick button that could be used in tandem with each other, allowing for more variety in how you can stomp down enemies. In order to differentiate Bayonetta further from DMC, Camille and the devs also incorporated the Wicked Weave mechanic into the combat, where most combos end with Bayo summoning a giant demon appendage in order to maximize the damage done and stun the enemy so that you can keep on attacking, with longer combos producing stronger Wicked Weaves. On top of all this, you can also purchase unique techniques from Rodin's Gates of Hell, like Witch Twist and Afterburner Kick, which opens up even more choices for how you can fight the angels you encounter throughout the game. Honestly, there are so many mechanics to use in this game that you can't be blamed for feeling a bit overwhelmed when you're first playing through it and are dealing with the more challenging sections, since it can be a bit of sensory overload trying to remember all the different techniques you can do, resulting in some first-time players simply mashing buttons and hoping it works out, a method also known as the Eddie Gordo Gambit. The devs were aware of how many mechanics they'd squeezed into this game though, so to make sure that the player had a chance to practice with the variety of techniques they were given, they made the clever decision to make the loading screens between chapters a training room. So rather than having to sit and wait while the game loads, you get a chance to play around with the different combos and techniques Bayo has, all with a fighting game style combo listing on the side that even shows how many times you've used a particular combo and which ones you've yet to try. So while the game can definitely be challenging at times, it's not like it isn't trying to help you learn as you go. And it's these helpful little design elements that makes Bayonetta one of the most beginner-friendly character action games out there. Yes, Camille does like to regularly grade you on how well you're doing, with little medals indicating how well you've done after most fights, and getting a stone statue at the end of a chapter can feel a bit demoralizing since it's the equivalent of getting a D- on a term paper, but there are elements to the game that are there to help you get better and earn those platinum medals. For example, there are universal combo strings and attacks in this game. As any proper character action game should, there is a plethora of weapons that Bayonetta can collect throughout the game, from swords to rocket launchers to lightsabers, but no matter what you're using or what combination of weapons you have equipped to Bayo, most sequences of buttons are designed to do similar attacks or combos. Rotating the movement stick will result in a spin attack for crowd control, punch punch kick punch is for a quick and easy Wicked Weave combo, and mashing the punch attack leads to a flurry of fists or slashes. And just because I'm sure there's someone out there waiting for it, here's your JoJo reference. As opposed to all the unique attacks that all of Dante's Devil Arms had, each with their own specific commands, Bayonetta's skills and combos are pretty much universal across Bayonetta's arsenal. The thing that changes most depending on what arrangement of weapons you're using is the unique trait that each weapon has. Bayonetta's whip, aside from being pretty kinky, lets you pull Bayo closer to enemies or just grab and toss them around in a huge circle, while her ice skates can freeze enemies into giant ice cubes after enough hits. Or there's her swords that allow for pretty quick, widespread slashing attacks, while her Darja claws allow you to switch between element types and can do unique charge attacks. The type of weapon you're using also changes the type of wicked weaves that come out at the end of particular combos, both in terms of appearance and function. So this variety in not only attack combos, but also in the individual weapon skills, means there's an almost infinite amount of potential for inventive attack patterns where you try to figure out the most fun and stylish way to beat down a group of angels. Or just keep mashing punch, punch, kick, punch until you get to the end. But while it's good to know the most effective combos and skills in order to achieve pure platinum status at the end of chapters, there's no requirement that you need to know every single one of them to do well in the game. Truthfully, I didn't even know about a majority of the special mechanics some of the weapons had when I first went through the game, like the laser beam that Shuraba can do if you hold down the lock-on button long enough, because it makes it relatively simple to make it through without needing to know all the intricate and complex mechanics, as long as you pay attention to what you and your enemies are doing. But if you're the type that loves in-depth combat systems, there is plenty here for you. Basically, Bayonetta is the perfect example of the easy-to-learn, difficult-to-master type of game design. In that same vein of making things a bit simpler for newcomers, Bayonetta also fixes the dodge mechanic that DMC never really seemed to want to make work. What I mean by that is that when you get your hands on Bayonetta's dodge system, you realize how clunky and unhelpful the dodge mechanic in DMC really was in hindsight, as Bayonetta's witch dodge is much more fluid and easy to use, being that it's dedicated to its own button, rather than having to share a spot with the jump button like it's the annoying younger brother that has to tag along. With DMC, jumping was always a more effective way to dodge attacks rather than having to lock onto an enemy and dodge rolling around them, so it never felt like a useful tool when playing the game. With Bayonetta, on the other hand, dodging isn't simply an option for you, it was designed as an essential mechanic. At a surface view, Bayonetta's dodge works like any other game's dodge mechanic does, in that it allows Bayo to avoid damage temporarily when used. Though, if you time the dodge at the right moment when an incoming attack is coming, just before it hits you, Bayo will activate Witch Time, slowing down everything around her and allowing you to punish all the angels that are now open, a mechanic which was likely inspired by the slowdown effect in Beautiful Joe. Though, compared to the slowdown in Beautiful, making Witch Time dependent on your timing rather than something you just activate freely makes it much more gratifying to activate, since it requires you to wait for the last moment of an incoming attack and not too soon before. And having that all or nothing design means achieving it is much more rewarding. This mechanic could be seen as game breaking though, since the Witch Dodge has a lot of invincibility frames, and you could hypothetically just constantly dodge around enemies endlessly until you activate Witch Time, but the devs didn't want to make things too easy for you, so they designed it so that if you abuse the dodge and use it too often in a short amount of time, then Bayo ends up taking a short break and becomes vulnerable to attacks. So there is a need to learn how and when to use it properly. Now, it isn't absolutely essential to know how to do Witch Time perfectly at the very start of the game, since the early chapters are designed around you still getting a grasp on all the basics, though the game does expect you to know how to perform it at some of the later stages, as there are enemies that need you to go into Witch Time in order to do damage to them, or become extremely hard to handle if you can't slow down their movements. So while it might seem like just another ability in Bayo's arsenal, Witch Time is probably the most defining feature of Bayonetta's gameplay, as a lot of the mechanics are balanced around it. In fact, you truly start to realize how essential Witch Time is to the gameplay when it's taken away from you, like with the gold-plated angels that aren't affected by it, or bosses that are tougher to get the dodge timing on. and that is actually a slight problem in itself. When the mechanic is taken away from you, you start to feel like a small child without their stuffed animal, as you lose that extra level of security, and suddenly it becomes much more difficult not to get hit by attacks. Now this can be a fun way to challenge veteran players, but newcomers to the series can feel quite lost when something that's been the core of their success is removed, making dealing with enemies like Gracious and Glorious rather frustrating to deal with. At the same time, this is also the subtle charm to Bayonetta's gameplay, because the difficulty is kind of what you make of it. Essentially, if you're fine with using the healing items the game lets you make and getting stone or bronze trophies at the end of chapters, you can get through the game fine by mashing buttons and still get to see the cool action spectacles that happen during combos and the over-the-top cutscenes. The game doesn't punish you if you aren't perfect at the combat, but it also doesn't reward you for it either. Because if you want to be able to do all the cool, intricate combos you see in trick videos, and be able to get platinum trophies, which are needed to unlock some of the post-game content, you will eventually have to learn some of the nuances to the combat systems, like the subtle timing to enemy attacks, or how to perform advanced techniques like dodge offsets. Probably one of the most important things to learn though, and the last piece to Bayonetta's combat, is the magic system. Continuing this ongoing theme of improving what they did with the Devil May Cry series, Team Little Angels worked a magic gauge into Bayonetta's already quite involved combat systems, which was very much like Dante's Devil Trigger gauge, where you built up meter as you do damage and avoid it yourself. Though Bayonetta does a little bit more with it than just a powered up state for the main character. Now at first, the only real use it has is Bayonetta's somewhat infamous torture attack, where at the cost of a full magic gauge, Bayonetta can do some magic BDSM techniques mixed with medieval torture devices in order to do a heavy amount of damage on a single enemy and gain more style points for it, while having the added benefit of being invulnerable to attacks from surrounding enemies. So it's a useful thing when you want to get rid of the tougher angels during fights with larger groups. Eventually though, once you collect enough halos to purchase them, another effective way to use the magic gauge is with the accessories and techniques you can buy in the Gates of Hell. At Rodin's bar, you can buy a plethora of things to help Bayo in her fights, from new techniques that can be powered up at the cost of some magic, to health ups, to alternative versions of weapons, to sexy cosplay costumes. But one of the most game-changing things you can buy from Rodin, and the most expensive, is the magical accessories that Bayo can equip. While many of these accessories require some magic to use while in combat, these bits of jewelry can actually change how you play the game quite a bit, making it easier or harder depending on what you equipped. For example, the Star of Donetta lets you recover a bit of health after you taunt an enemy, which gives even more incentive to use the taunt function, even if it makes the angels stronger and less vulnerable to being stunned. But this can be helpful when you're in a bind with a low amount of health. On the other hand, if you use the Gaze of Despair, it keeps all enemies in a constant taunted state, making them much more aggressive and increasing their damage, but with the added benefit of replenishing more magic and giving more combo points when fought, which is useful when you're trying to get platinum trophies or grinding for halos, but isn't really something for first-time players. Personally though, my favorite accessory is the Moon of Mahakala, which enables a parry system for you to use when it's equipped, blocking enemy attacks if you go in their direction at the exact instance it's about to hit you, and it is so satisfying to get a perfect block on an enemy when you get the timing right. But while they can be game-changing, the trouble with the accessories is that all of them cost quite a bit to unlock, so unless you grind for halos by repeating chapters you already beat, it isn't likely you'll get to them by the end of your first playthrough, meaning most players don't really get the chance to experiment with them a lot during their first time going through the game, which is a shame since they can drastically change how you approach the combat. Though between regular combos, a multitude of weapon skills, wicked weaves, torture attacks, special techniques, and accessories, there is so much to delve into Bayonetta's combat that I honestly can't blame someone for missing some of the hidden systems the game has. Going from DMC1 to Bayo, you can see how much Team Little Angels stepped their game up with the combat mechanics, both in the sheer amount of systems going on and the accessibility, making something that is simultaneously easy to get into, but gives a lot of places to go if you want to learn more, resulting in a game that has an almost infinite amount of replayability. But while I have a lot of praise for the gameplay of Bayonetta, there are also some flaws with the game too, with the biggest sadly being its story. Now, while it might not be apparent to most, there is actually a story to Bayonetta, even if it requires a giant conspiracy corkboard to piece it all together. The problem is just that the game does a poor job at conveying the plot, due to both a very convoluted pacing and badly defined character motivations. For a brief recap, Bayonetta is one of the last of a race of UMBRAN witches, who waged a war with another rival clan called the Lumen Sages 500 years ago after an ancient pact was broken regarding the two Eyes of the World gems that both sides respectively governed. All details of which is covered in the 5-minute prologue of the game while you fight angels on a fallen clock tower. Fast forward to modern times, Bayonetta is found at the bottom of a lake with no memory of who she is and how she got there, with only a jewel that is supposedly the left eye of the world in her medallion on her chest. So she spends 20 years hunting angels with Rodin in hopes of getting her memory back at some point. Then, after getting a tip from her informant Enzo that a wealthy person had tried to sell a jewel called the right eye of the world on the black market, Bayo heads to Vigrid Europe to swipe it in hopes that it might bring her memory back. Though this plot point is essentially forgotten about or ignored after it's brought up and is solely just to get the plot moving. From here, Bayonetta goes between action set piece to fight sequence with angels across multiple vaguely ethno-European locales, with regular appearances by Bayonetta's old friend and rival Jean, who we get regular flashbacks to regarding Bayo's past, Luca, a journalist who is trying to expose Bayonetta as an evil witch who killed his father, and Cereza, a small girl who believes Bayonetta is her mother. And from chapter 4 to 14, the story is mostly an angel fighting road trip with Luca and Cereza, with Bayonetta having flashbacks to her past vaguely explaining what happened sprinkled throughout. The actual plot of the game doesn't really kick in until after the final boss fight with Jean, where, after being defeated, the mind-washing that made her into an antagonist is removed, because being beaten up is always how you reverse mental reprogramming. Jean then reveals that Bayonetta is actually Cereza herself, and she was the cause of the war 500 years ago because she was the result of an UMBRAN witch and a Lumen Sage hooking up, which is forbidden due to it being prophesied that a child conceived by this type of relationship would become the left eye of the world and be used to resurrect the god Jubileus. So basically it's the old, the thing you were looking for was in you all along speech.
Oh, will you help me? Can you help me? You don't need to be helped any longer. You've always had the power to go back to Kansas. I have.
Then why didn't you tell her before?
Because she wouldn't have believed me. She had to learn it for herself.
And then Jean seemingly gets killed by the rockets that she herself fired for some reason prior to the fight starting. From here, Bayonetta goes on to face the person who's been in control of everything up to now, a Lumen Sage by the name of Baldur. And it is revealed during this confrontation that he is actually Cereza's father. Though this is the first time we've actually encountered this character, so this reveal doesn't really matter that much or have any actual emotional impact on the story. But it wouldn't be a Kamiya game if there wasn't some kind of revelation about a family member at some point. It's from here that Baldur does another giant exposition dump before the final boss fight with him, where he explains the entire plot of the story was his doing in order to bring Bayonetta to him so that he could combine his right eye and Bayonetta's left eye of the world to awaken Jubileus and gain ultimate power. A plan which included bringing a young Cereza to the present in order to awaken the left eye of the world in her, because her past self needed to see what happened in the present in order to awaken her powers later on in the present when she's an adult. So he created a time distortion in order to have Bayonetta find her younger self and be the one to show her something. Yeah, so this is when the story just starts to fall apart entirely due to how convoluted the plot becomes and how poorly paced it is. You see, Bayonetta at the end of the day is all about cool spectacle, like having Bayo and Jean fighting on an airplane as it's slowly crashing through a city, or Bayo using a giant piece of a cathedral to block an incoming fireball. But the amount of these spectacle moments somewhat ruins any type of pacing that the story tries to have, and makes it hard to be invested in the story, since the action is clearly what the player is supposed to be focusing on, especially when you have to be worried about very unforgiving QTEs that can happen during these cutscenes. From chapter to chapter, you jump from an ancient European town to a coliseum in the skies, to a busy highway, to flying on a cruise missile, all with no strong rhyme or reason to why you are at any of these places, aside from that is where Bayonetta was placed in the story. Every chapter tries to have a unique set piece or action sequence, which makes a lot of these levels memorable in their own way, but it also makes it hard to get into the slower moments the story has. So these scenes that are meant to be about the characters and plot are much less memorable in comparison to seeing Bayonetta summoning a swarm of giant spiders in order to tear apart an angel she's just defeated, meaning it's difficult to keep track of all the plot points that are brought up. This is why, despite Bayonetta being a fun and unique character that is very different from most other video game protagonists, people only seem to remember her for her over-the-top sexualization and combat ability, because the story isn't designed to allow for a lot of character exploration and development, aside from maybe Luca getting over thinking Bayo killed his father. And that's only because he developed a crush for her, and he eventually finds out that it was actually Boulder and a group of angels that did it. But while he did try to have the occasional emotional moment throughout the game, like Bayonetta connecting with her younger self, Kamiya's goal with Bayonetta wasn't about having a nuanced narrative with a lot of pathos and character arcs. Kamiya's focus, much like with his other titles, was on making the character, and by extension the player, as cool as possible, even if it means pacing and character motivations go out the window. And you can really see this in the scenes where the plot takes a back seat so that he can have Bayonetta cruising down a highway on a motorcycle, or riding a missile while shooting down angels. He wants to make a game that is, above all else, fun to play, much like the games he grew up playing as a kid, like Space Harrier and Outrun, which is also why he included homages to these games in the previously mentioned vehicle sections.
Welcome to my fantasy zone.
Get ready.
However, when Kamiya's sense for fun and over-the-top action works with the story, it works spectacularly. And nowhere is this better exhibited than in the final chapter of the game. Because if there's one thing that Bayonetta is notorious for, it is the ending. After you defeat Boulder for the first time, it seems that the game has finally ended, with Bayonetta taking Kid Cereza home to the past and Luca waiting for her in the present. With most other games of the time, this would be the ending of the story, where the main characters would walk off into the sunset after finally defeating the big bad. But with Bayonetta, this is all meant to lull you into a false sense of finality, and then fake you out. As Boulder pulls a resurrection, saying this has all been a part of his already convoluted plan, and proceeds to capture Bayonetta so that he can take her up into space in a rocket ship so that he can use her left eye of the world to awaken the god Jubileus. A very much alive Jean then pursues them, combining the previous two vehicle sections into one when she uses a motorcycle to ride up the side of a rocket ship going into space while shooting down angels. And if you thought this is excessive, this is just the start of the whole thing. The moment-to-moment beats of the final chapter is another example of the evolution of Kamiya's style as a director, because the escalation to the final battle in Bayonetta is very much like what was at the end of Devil May Cry, Beautiful Joe, and Okami, though it takes it a few steps further. Once Jean gets to Jubileus, she pulls out Bayonetta before seemingly dying yet again as she floats off into the void of space, leading to Bayonetta letting her hair down in preparation for a final multi-staged boss fight. And this is one of the largest scale boss fights around, as it involves Jubileus literally throwing galaxies at you and creating vortexes that are insta-kills if you touch them. But once you finally get to the end of the last bar of health, Bayonetta conjures her final massive summon, Queen Sheba, and proceeds to punch Jubileus into the sun in order to destroy her entirely, which leads into the credits as Bayonetta sadly falls to Earth on top of the god's broken remains. With the deity now defeated, Bayonetta is finally done. But this is yet another fake out, as you and a very much alive Jean then have to demolish the leftover fragments of Jubileus before you plummet into Earth's atmosphere, perfectly paralleling the starting prologue of the game where the two witches fought angels together 500 years ago.
Let's go! Just stay close to me!
The final chapter of the game is so well known, not only because it tricks you multiple times into thinking that it's finally finished, but also because the game takes all that the player has grown to expect of it in terms of action and spectacle, and just keeps building onto it. Bayonetta starts with you fighting a group of angels in a small graveyard with only a set of ordinary pistols, and gradually builds up to you fighting God in space. And with how the game escalates to that, it feels like this is the logical conclusion. It wouldn't be fitting for Bayonetta if the final fight was something where you just barely defeated the final boss in some kind of castle or skyscraper. It had to be one where you literally threw them into the sun and then shattered their remains as you hurtled towards Earth. This is why, despite the game having a completely nonsensical story, it can still put a smile on my face with moments like this, due to how hard it tries to make something as fun and crazy as possible for the player to enjoy, resulting in an experience that is incredibly memorable. And the game ends with this story coming full circle. Returning to the graveyard where we started from, Bayonetta and her friends are back to hunting angels again, with the status quo finally returned.
Let's dance, boys!
In the end, there was so much that I couldn't fit into this retrospective, like the secret weapons and boss fights, or the fact that Camilla loved the dancing that Bayo's mocap performer did so much that he made an entire dance video for those who beat the game. But I think that shows how much passion Team Little Angels had for this project. Camilla and his team put so much love and effort into Bayonetta that supposedly the Xbox 360 discs were actually packed to the maximum limit that the discs could hold. And it's this love for making fun and enjoyable games that make fans, myself included, adore Camilla and the rest of the devs at Platinum, even if Camilla blocked me on Twitter. And this admiration shows in the legacy that the game created. When it finally released in late 2009, early 2010, Bayonetta sold and reviewed incredibly well, even in spite of the PS3 port of the game having a lot of frame rate and loading issues. It became highly regarded for its accessible but deep combat, the jazzy up-tempo music used during fights, the unique designs found throughout the game, the fun campy characters in the story, and the over-the-top ending. It's due to this reception that Bayonetta ended up being the introduction to character action games for a wide range of people that might not have gone into them otherwise, keeping the torch alive for the genre while the DMC series took a slight hiatus. I honestly don't think we would still be talking about these types of games as much if Bayonetta wasn't the huge critical success it turned out to be. But while those who love character action games were glad to see it prosper in the mainstream in such a big way, Bayonetta's success was also quite important for Platinum Games too, because, unfortunately, all their other initial titles during their formative years, like Vanquish and Mad World, sold relatively poorly for whatever reason. So Platinum needed Bayonetta to be the hit it turned out to be if they wanted to continue making the games they wanted to, which resulted in Bayonetta being the foundation that the studio was built on. Platinum Games were the ones who made Bayonetta, but Bayonetta retroactively ended up making Platinum Games. as it would set the precedent for what gamers would expect from the studio, for better or for worse. High-octane action, fast and responsive gameplay, challenging difficulty, colorful characters, over-the-top boss fights in space. These are now considered hallmarks of a Platinum game, and it's all due to Bayonetta's success. Yet, while Bayonetta set a new bar for what players could expect from a character action game, that is nothing compared to what Platinum would do with its sequel. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.